What would you do if the one decision everyone mocked you for turned out to be the very choice that saved your life? Out on the dusty edges of Wyoming, a worn-down cowboy stopped at a roadside auction he never meant to visit. He had nothing left to lose until he looked into the eyes of a broken mare standing between her trembling foals. In that moment, fate shifted, and the choice he made would ripple farther than anyone in town could have imagined. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. Stay with me, because the story you're about to hear shows how a single act of compassion can change everything. The wind came early that morning, dry, restless, and full of red Wyoming dust. It swept across the outskirts of Cody like a warning, rattling loose fence posts and making the old roadside signs creak on their rusty chains. Caleb Turner drove through the haze with the windows cracked just enough to keep the truck from overheating. Dust floated in and settled on the cracked dashboard. The pickup groaned underneath him, every bolt sounding as tired as the man behind the wheel. The bed of the truck carried only a few tools, a dented toolbox, 2 rusted wire cutters, a wooden post he planned to sell for scrap. None of it would bring in much money, but much wasn't what Caleb was aiming for. Enough was all he needed, enough to buy another week before the bank came knocking, enough to delay losing the ranch that had belonged to his family for 3 generations. The ranch had been dying long before his father passed. Years of drought, the collapse of beef prices, and the constant repairs no one had the money to finish had chewed it down to its bones. And now it was chewing on him. Inside the truck, the silence was heavy. No radio, no talking. Just the low rumbling of the old engine and the moaning wind outside his window. He sipped weak gas station coffee and kept driving, passing the faded wooden arch that marked the entrance to the Cody stockyard. He didn't even slow down. There was no reason to stop. He wasn't buying anything. He couldn't afford to buy anything. But then clang. A sharp metallic crack shot through the air, carried by the wind like a thrown stone. Caleb's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Another clang followed, then a chorus of voices, fast, loud, and strangely cheerful. He recognized the sound instantly. An auctioneer's gavel. Against his better judgment, he eased off the gas. Curiosity tugged at him in a way he couldn't explain. Maybe it was the distraction. Maybe it was the familiar rhythm of a world he used to be part of. Maybe it was simply the fact that deep down he hadn't seen a crowd in weeks, and loneliness was a hungry animal. He pulled off the road and rolled to a stop along the dusty shoulder. Just for a minute, he muttered to himself, just long enough to stretch my legs. He got out, bought another cheap coffee from a wooden kiosk, and walked toward the crowd gathered beneath the corrugated metal awning. From the back, he watched quietly, hands wrapped around the flimsy paper cup, steam rising into the cold air. He didn't plan to bid. He didn't plan to speak. He just watched. The auction was nearing its end. Most of the good stock had already been sold, big chestnut geldings with strong shoulders, paint mares with glossy coats, a pair of roans from a ranch outside Thermopolis. Buyers shook hands, money swapped pockets, and the energy of the crowd began to fade as people drifted toward their trucks. Then the auctioneer, red-faced and sweating, slapped his palm on the podium. All right, folks, last lot of the day. A few people paused mid-stride. Others turned back out of habit. Caleb took a sip of coffee, stale, watery, but the warmth felt good against the chill. A gate creaked open, and the mood shifted. 2 ranch hands tugged a halter rope, bringing out a mare so thin it hurt to look at. Her coat, once likely a deep bay or chestnut, had turned a dull, dusty brown. The sharp edges of her ribs pressed through her hide, and her mane lay tangled across her neck like a forgotten rope. Behind her stumbled 2 foals, spindly-legged, shivering, and painfully young. One of them, the smaller one, tripped over its own feet and nearly fell. The mare whipped her head around, stepped sideways, and placed her body between the foal and the crowd, as if shielding it from something she'd grown far too used to. A few murmurs rippled through the onlookers. The auctioneer didn't bother hiding his disdain. "Used-up breeder," he announced with a shrug. "Had too many babies. No value left in her." He flipped a page on his clipboard. "Owner says, move her cheap, or move her by weight." Someone in the crowd laughed. "Sell her straight to the meat buyer." More laughter followed, sharp, careless, and far too loud. Caleb felt a pinch in his chest, the kind that comes from seeing something you know shouldn't exist. Something that used to be proud and strong, reduced to a shadow. The mare didn't flinch at the laughter. She just stood there, breathing hard, positioning herself so both foals were tucked close to her sides. Her eyes flicked across the crowd, fast, frightened, searching. And then she looked at him. Caleb lowered his coffee cup. Her eyes were not angry and not wild the way abused animals sometimes looked. They didn't beg or plead. They simply endured. Worn-out eyes in a worn-out body, eyes that had weathered far more than any creature deserved. Dust swirled between them. A gust of wind pushed Caleb's hat back slightly, forcing him to put a hand to the brim. The auctioneer slapped his palm on the podium again. "All right, folks, starting the bidding low. $20. Do I hear 20 silence? 15, 10, and nothing. $5, a man grinned. "Just weigh her. You'll make more." The auctioneer rolled his eyes and waved to the ranch hands. "All right, move her out." Without thinking, Caleb stepped forward. "I'll take her," he said. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it cut through the noise like a clean blade. The crowd turned. The auctioneer blinked. "What was that?" Caleb swallowed once. "I'll take this broken mare and her foals." Silence fell again, real silence this time. Then someone barked a laugh. "Turner, you can't even pay your ranch taxes." Another chimed in. Boy's lost his mind. The auctioneer raised a brow. "You sure about this? No refunds?" Caleb nodded once. "Ain't asking for one." More laughter erupted. Loud, mocking, unkind. But Caleb barely heard it. His eyes were still on the mare. Her ears flicked. Her head lifted a little higher. Not much, but enough to show she understood something was changing. Or maybe she simply hoped it was. Caleb reached for his back pocket, pulled out his wallet, and opened it. A thin stack of wrinkled bills sat inside, everything he had left that wasn't already owed to somebody. He handed them over without counting, knowing the auctioneer would take every last one. He signed the receipt with a pencil worn down to a nub. The ranch hand holding the mare's rope hesitated before placing it in Caleb's hand. "She's skittish," the man warned. Caleb nodded. "I know." He stepped backward, giving the mare space. She didn't follow at first. She just stared at him, her whole body trembling from exhaustion and uncertainty. The foals pressed against her legs, waiting because they didn't know what else to do. Caleb loosened the rope and spoke softly. "Come on, girl. Let's go." She took one hesitant step, then another. The smaller foal stumbled but caught its balance and hurried after her. The larger one stayed close, nudging its sibling along. Behind Caleb, the crowd had already dismissed him the way people dismiss a man who makes foolish decisions when he's desperate. "Turner's ranch is done for," someone muttered. "Waste of money. He'll never keep him alive." He didn't turn around. He walked across the red dirt through the blowing dust, leading the mare and her babies away from the stockyard and everything it stood for. At the gate, he paused for a moment. The mare looked back once, as if expecting someone to drag her away again. When no one came, she lowered her head. Caleb guided her through the open gate and toward his waiting truck. Behind him, the stockyard's metal doors clanged shut, sealing the noise and cruelty of the place behind them. Why do you think Caleb bought those useless horses when he could barely save himself? Tell us what you would have done. And don't forget to subscribe before we step into the most powerful part of the story. The drive back to Turner Ranch took Caleb along the long gravel road that wound between sun-scorched grass and scatterings of sagebrush. The sky stretched wide and pale the way only a Wyoming sky could, endless, unforgiving, and honest. As the pickup crested the last hill, the ranch appeared below a lonely patchwork of wood wire and the remnants of better years. The front gate leaned so far sideways that even the wind could make it groan. Caleb pushed it open, the hinges shrieking a metallic complaint that echoed across the quiet land. Beyond it lay the pastures, wide but tired, the grass dead and brittle, the earth cracked like old leather. A few stubborn cactus patches clung to life near the rocks. Then came the house, its wooden siding silvered from years of weather, and its metal roof warped from a lifetime of Wyoming storms. The barn beside it stood hollow and dim, its open doorway revealing coils of forgotten rope and a bucket rolling lazily in the wind. Caleb parked the truck and stepped out. For a long moment, he just stood there looking at the place he hadn't been able to fix, the place he stubbornly refused to abandon. He opened the trailer gate. The mare hesitated. Her hooves stayed planted on the wooden planks, ears flicking as she studied the unfamiliar yard. Only after a long pause did she take one trembling step down, followed by another. One foal stuck close to her flank, while the smaller one shivered so hard its legs almost gave out. Caleb reached gently toward the weaker foal, nudging it forward. They looked almost fragile against the empty ranch. He exhaled and murmured mostly to himself, "It ain't much, but it's home." Inside the barn, Caleb forked down fresh hay, not good hay, but good enough, and set out a bucket of water. When he brought it closer, the mare instantly backed away to the far corner, raising her head and flaring her nostrils. Her body curved protectively around the foal's chest, lifted and tense. "Easy," Caleb whispered, stopping where he stood. He set the hay down near the doorway and stepped back. After a full minute or two, the mare edged forward just enough for her foals to investigate the food. The wind pushed a cold draft through the barn, making both babies press their sides against her. Caleb spread an old blanket over a pile of straw to soften the ground. Then he lowered himself onto a crate near the entrance, where the setting sun cast a narrow beam of gold through the slats. He didn't move. He didn't reach. He just sat there, sipping the last of the lukewarm coffee from town. Hours passed that way. The sky outside dimmed to purple, then deep blue. The barn filled with the soft sounds of breathing, shifting hooves and foals, nudging their mother's belly for reassurance. Every so often, Caleb spoke quietly, "I ain't here to break you." And later, "Take your time." The mare's ears flicked with each word. Not frightened, just uncertain. The foals peeked at him through the gaps in the wooden boards, their big eyes blinking curiously. The mare looked at him too. Not with trust, not yet, but without the hostility he'd seen earlier that morning. It was a start. The next morning, a red pickup rolled down the drive, crunching gravel beneath its tires. Emily Carter stepped out, brushing stray hair from her face as she grabbed her veterinary kit from the passenger seat. She wore a leather coat boots dusted with dirt and an expression that said she'd seen every possible way an animal could be mistreated. "Morning, Caleb," she called. "Morning. Appreciate you coming." He led her to the barn. Emily's boots scuffed lightly as she stepped inside. The mare snorted and backed away, but she didn't lash out. Emily lifted her hands slowly. "Easy, girl. I'm not here to hurt you." She crouched a few feet away, observing the mare's posture, her labored breathing, the protective stance she held over her foals. Then Emily moved closer, and the truth revealed itself. The mare's ribs stood out starkly, each one a ridge beneath her stretched skin. Her udders were swollen in a way no healthy mare's should have been. And around her neck, beneath the matted hair, ran a deep, rubbed scar, thick pale and unmistakably from a rope that had been left on far too long. Emily pressed her lips together. This wasn't care, she said quietly. This was exploitation. Caleb stood stiffly, fists pressed against his hips. Emily examined the foals next. The sturdier one, he called him Dusty, moved with youthful energy, though his bones showed hunger. But the smaller one struggled simply to stay upright. His legs trembled. His joints were soft. He took shallow breaths. Was he born early? Caleb asked. Emily nodded grimly. Looks that way. She ran practiced hands along the foal's legs, then checked his gums and heartbeat. She wasn't raised, Emily murmured. She was used. The words cut deeper than Caleb expected. He tightened his grip on his hat brim. Emily dug through her kit, pulling out vitamin paste, a syringe of mineral supplement, and instructions written on a folded sheet of paper. If Colt makes it through the week, she said he might have a real chance. She patted Caleb's arm as she left, her eyes softening with something like sympathy. He watched her truck disappear down the dirt road, then turned back to the barn, where the mare and her babies waited, thin, exhausted, but still fighting. By the next day, Riverton was buzzing with the story. Whispers filled the bar at lunchtime. Caleb's lost his damn mind. He can't even feed himself, let alone 3 horses. Poor fool. Should have let the meat buyer take him. Some spoke with ridicule, others with pity. A few simply shook their heads, remembering the Turner Ranch of old, what it had been and what it wasn't anymore. But not everyone had unkind things to say. Late in the afternoon, a small dust cloud rolled up the drive. Martha Green stepped out of her old station wagon, holding a warm apple pie wrapped in a cloth printed with faded sunflowers. She found Caleb fixing the barn door hinge and waited until he looked up. "Thought you might need this," she said, handing him the pie. He blinked in surprise. "I appreciate it." Martha rested a hand on his shoulder. "Broken don't mean finished, son." Caleb swallowed, unsure how to respond. She squeezed his arm gently. "Your daddy would have done the same." Her words lingered long after she drove away. That night, winter crept back early. A hard wind sliced through the ranch, rattling loose boards and plunging temperatures down to the low 20s. Caleb tossed more straw into the barn, trying to make it warmer, but the draft found every crack. Colt was the first to show signs of trouble. The foal's legs trembled violently, and his breaths became fast and shallow. Dusty nudged him worriedly, but Colt couldn't stay standing. He staggered sideways and collapsed onto the straw. Caleb heard the faint thump and rushed inside. The mare panicked instantly, jerking around, stamping the ground, her body forming a barrier between Colt and Caleb. Her eyes were wide and frantic nostrils flaring like she expected the world to hurt him again. Caleb raised both hands. "Easy, girl. I'm trying to help." For a moment, she didn't budge. Then, with a trembling exhale, she stepped aside. Caleb knelt, slipping his arms beneath Colt's tiny, weightless body. The foal felt cold, too cold and limp, in a way that drained the color from Caleb's face. He pressed a hand to the foal's chest. The heartbeat was there, but faint, fragile. He wrapped Colt in his own coat, tucking the little body close to his chest. The cold bit at Caleb's skin, but he ignored it. He carried Colt to the corner of the barn, where he'd rigged an old steel basin into a makeshift heater. He lit the coals and fed the flame carefully until warmth radiated outward. Caleb sat cross-legged, resting Colt in his lap, shielding him from the chill. Minutes turned into hours. He rubbed the foal's legs, placed his ear against the tiny rib cage, listened for every rise and fall of breath. Several times Colt's breathing wavered, faded, paused. Each time Caleb leaned down and whispered, his voice rough but steady, "Don't you quit on me." Not tonight. Outside the circle of firelight, the mare stood watching. She did not lie down. She did not rest. Her eyes stayed fixed on the man holding her child, her muscles trembling with fear and hope. The wind howled through the slats of the barn, but inside a different kind of storm raged the fragile fight to keep a life from slipping away. By dawn, Caleb was half asleep, stiff and chilled to the bone. The fire had died down to embers. He barely noticed the faint movement in his lap, until a soft, wet sneeze hit his chin. Colt wriggled. Then he kicked weak but alive. A breathy laugh escaped Caleb, raw and relieved. "Well, look at you," he murmured. "Stubborn little thing." He wrapped Colt tighter and carried him back to the stall. The mare approached, slowly lowering her head until her muzzle brushed the foal's flank. Colt nuzzled her in return. Then something surprising happened. The mare stepped forward and touched Caleb's shoulder gently, almost like a thank you, almost like an apology. For the first time, she didn't flinch. Dusty tottered around their legs, bumping into Caleb's boots, as if claiming him as part of their little herd. The mare lowered her head, bowing slightly, a sign of acceptance, trust, perhaps even surrender to a new beginning. Caleb raised a hand and laid it softly against her neck. She didn't move away. "We're gonna make it," he whispered. "All of us." And for the first time since he'd brought them home, the barn didn't feel empty. It felt like the start of something worth saving. The weather shifted the following afternoon. The wind, which had been gentle for most of the day, suddenly carried a heavy grit that scraped along the fence posts and hissed across the empty pastures. Caleb was out by the paddock, repairing another section of sagging wire when he heard the deep growl of an engine climbing the ranch road. He wiped sweat and dust from his brow and turned just as a black pickup rolled to a stop near the barn. Its polished chrome looked out of place against the worn, wind-beaten ranch. The door opened, and Hank Mercer stepped out, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, going gray, at the temples dressed in a leather jacket that cost more than Caleb's monthly groceries. A gold ring glinted on his hand as he shut the door behind him. Hank surveyed the ranch with the sneer of a man accustomed to judging value and finding none. "Well, now," he drawled, "didn't know you were in the business of rescuing trash stock Turner." Caleb set his tools down slowly. He didn't answer right away, just wiped his hands on his jeans and faced Hank with a guarded expression. The two men stood in silence long enough for the wind to hum between them. "What do you want?" Hank Caleb finally asked. Hank's smirk widened. He stepped closer, boots crunching through the dust. "That mare you picked up," he said. "She used to belong to my breeding program." Caleb felt his jaw tighten. So Hank continued, "she's worth more than you know. $1 million bloodline Turner, top stock." He tapped his ring against his belt buckle. "That's why she foaled so many times. Genetics like hers don't come cheap." Caleb didn't look at Hank. Instead, he glanced toward the barn. Through the cracked boards, he could see the mare's silhouette shift. Her ears flicked backward, and she shifted her weight nervously. Even from across the yard, she recognized Hank's voice, and it frightened her. "Bloodlines," Caleb muttered under his breath. "That what you call what you did to her?" Hank ignored the comment. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a checkbook, flipping it open with a practiced flick of his wrist. "Let's make this simple." He scribbled down a number 1 that made Caleb's stomach twist. It was more money than he'd seen in years. "You sell her back to me, we both walk away happy." Caleb didn't even glance at the paper. "No," he said. Hank blinked. "No, you heard me." Hank laughed loud and sharp like the crack of a whip. "You can't afford her bloodline." Caleb met his gaze squarely. "I don't care about bloodlines." The laughter died. Hank's eyes went cold, flat, predatory. He folded the check, slid it back into his coat, and stepped onto the truck's running board. Before climbing in, he paused, staring hard at Caleb. "This conversation isn't over." The truck roared to life, its tires spinning up a cloud of red dust as it tore down the drive. When the haze settled, the ranch felt unsettlingly quiet. The next morning broke with pale pink light stretching across the horizon. Caleb walked toward the barn with a bucket of warm mash for the Mare and Foals, but something felt off. The earth near the barn seemed freshly disturbed. He crouched. Tire tracks, fresh ones, cut deep around the back of the building. Boot prints, too, sunk into the damp earth, still recovering from yesterday's frost. Inside the stall, Dusty whinnied anxiously and darted in circles. Colt huddled near the mare's legs, trembling. The mare stood rigid, neck arched, blowing harsh breaths through flared nostrils as she stared toward the padlock on the door. Caleb inspected it closely. Scratches. Fresh ones. Someone had tried to force it open. He stepped back, fists clenching. So Hank had come back in the night. He wasn't just bluffing. He wasn't done. Caleb strode to the house and grabbed his phone. "Sheriff Alvarez," he said when the call connected. "I need you out here." The sheriff arrived 30 minutes later in a white SUV coated with dust from the ranch road. Sheriff Tom Alvarez was a level-headed man in his 50s, with the kind of stare that had seen just about everything and stopped being surprised by most of it. He walked the perimeter, slowly examining every track, every mark. He stood up straight with a weary sigh. Men like Hank don't let money walk away. Caleb crossed his arms. "So what do I do? Lock your barn every night? Keep lights on. Call me if you hear anything." Alvarez glanced toward the mare. "But you and I both know Hank's not afraid of the law. Never has been." Caleb nodded grimly. The sheriff clapped a hand on his shoulder, then climbed back into the SUV. Caleb watched the vehicle disappear, wishing the reassurance felt stronger than it did. But reassurance wasn't coming. Not that day, and not the next. As the sun slid toward the mountains that evening, the wind picked up again, strong, restless, as though it knew trouble was brewing. Caleb had just finished hauling water when he heard the distant rumble of another engine. He turned toward the ridge. A large truck crested the rise and rolled down toward the ranch. Not Hank's black pickup this time. This was bigger, heavier, the kind used for hauling livestock. It stopped a couple 100 yards from the barn. 3 figures climbed out. Hank Mercer, and 2 hired hands, broad-shouldered, hard-eyed men with rope coils and metal tools hanging from their belts. Caleb's stomach dropped. The 3 men advanced toward the barn with grim purpose. One pulled a rope taut between his fists. The other gripped a metal bar designed to break locks without leaving obvious damage. Inside the barn, the mare's ears shot straight up. She recognized Hank instantly. Her eyes blew wide as she swung her body around, standing between the foals and the stall door. Dusty squealed. Colt pressed himself beneath her belly. Caleb started running. The world narrowed to the pounding of his boots on the dirt and the blood thundering in his ears. Dust flew up around his legs as he sprinted across the field, the setting sun throwing his shadow long and dark across the ground. "Hey!" he shouted, breath burning in his chest. Hank didn't stop. Neither did his hired men. One of them jammed the metal rod against the lock. Caleb reached them just as the rod scraped hard against the latch. "You're trespassing," Caleb said, voice low but fierce. Hank turned unbothered. I'm taking what's mine. Caleb stepped closer, close enough that the fading sunlight cut sharp lines along both their faces. You don't get to own what you tried to destroy, he said. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The men gripping the ropes exchanged a look, then tightened their hold. Dust spiraled around their boots. The mare shrieked from inside, the stall hooves slamming against the ground in panic. A showdown hung in the air, silent, taut, and seconds from breaking. Then, a piercing siren split the evening. Red and blue lights flashed through the cloud of dust as Sheriff Alvarez's SUV roared toward them. The sheriff braked hard, stepped out, and placed a steady hand on the holster at his side. Step away from the barn, he barked. Hank snarled. You can't prove anything. Sheriff Alvarez held up a folder. I've got reports from the state brand office. Paperwork you forged to move animals across county lines. And I've got testimony from Dr. Carter confirming abuse and illegal breeding practices. He took one step closer. You're done, Mercer. Hank's face drained of color. Turn around, Alvarez ordered. The cuffs clicked shut. Hank spat curses as he was hauled toward the SUV, dust swirling in the flashing lights. His two hired men were restrained as well, arrested for attempted theft and trespassing. Caleb stood there in the fading light, chest rising and falling, watching, as the law finally caught up with a man who had believed he was untouchable. The SUV pulled away, kicking up a plume of red dirt that drifted across the ranch like a departing storm. Only when silence settled again did Caleb hear a soft sound behind him. The mare. She pressed her head gently against the stall door, exhaling a long, trembling breath as if she could feel the danger had passed. Caleb walked to her, rested a hand on the door, and let the quiet of the moment fill him. For the first time since he'd brought her home, the ranch didn't feel haunted by loss. It felt protected, and she felt safe. News traveled fast in a small town, faster than the wind that blew dust across Riverton streets. By the very next morning, after Hank Mercer's arrest, the story had spread to every corner of town. At the Pine Creek bar, men paused mid-sip to shake their heads in disbelief. Caleb Turner took on Hank Mercer, one muttered over a plate of eggs. Another leaned back in his chair. And one a hell didn't see that coming. At the grocery store, two women whispered near the canned beans aisle. He saved that mare from being hauled off, one said softly. Emily told me those babies wouldn't be alive today if he hadn't stepped in. And at the gas station, old Martha Green puffed her chest a little as she filled her truck. About time someone stood up to that man, she told the attendant, who nodded with wide eyes. For the first time in years, Caleb's name wasn't followed by pity or mockery or talk of a failing ranch. People didn't see a struggling cowboy anymore. They saw a man who fought quietly, stubbornly for something that couldn't fight for itself. The following morning, when Caleb opened his front door to feed the horses, he stopped dead in his tracks. There, resting neatly on the dusty porch boards, sat a fresh bale of hay, golden and full, better than anything he could afford. Leaning beside it was a brand new roll of fencing wire. A folded piece of paper sat on top. For the mare and the little ones. Caleb blinked, unsure whether to smile or shake his head. Before he could decide, a pickup rumbled into the yard. Eli Bennett, one of the younger ranchers from down the road, jumped out, wiping grease off his hands. Heard you're fixin' fences today, Eli said. Thought you could use a hand. Caleb stared at him for a moment, speechless. Eli shrugged. Figured it's about time somebody helped you out, Turner. More trucks came as the morning went on. A retired rancher brought lumber slats. A pair of teenage brothers brought straw to refresh the mare's stall. Someone dropped off a bucket of mineral supplements. Another left a sack of oats. Soon the ranch, usually quiet enough to hear every gust of wind, buzzed with voices, footsteps, and the steady thump of tools hitting wood. Caleb stood among them, all overwhelmed. For years, Turner Ranch had been silent, shrinking in on itself like a house holding its breath. Now laughter echoed off the barn walls. "Hand me that hammer Caleb held. This roof needed replacing 10 years ago." "Don't worry, girl," someone murmured to the mare. "You're safe now." By sunset, the broken fence was straight and sturdy. The barn roof, newly patched, the paddock widened. Caleb walked through the yard like a man wandering into a dream. The ranch was changing, coming back to life. And so, in a quiet way, was he. The recovery came slowly at first. Dusty, the stronger foal, explored the pasture with enthusiasm, darting after grasshoppers, spinning circles around the mare, kicking up soft clouds of dust as he ran. Colt, still thin and fragile, watched his brother with longing. One afternoon, Caleb leaned on the fence rail, watching the two little colts in the field. Dusty dashed through a patch of tall grass, whinnying proudly. Colt blinked in his direction, then planted his feet uncertainly. "Come on, little fella," Caleb whispered. Colt tried. He pushed against the weakness in his legs, trembling with the effort. Once, twice, 3 times he stumbled. Dusty ran back and nudged him encouragingly, snorting into his neck. Then slowly, shakily, Colt stood. Not with help, not leaning on anything, just stood. Caleb felt a lump rise in his throat. "That's it," he called. "That's it, little fella. That's it." The mare let out a soft, high sound that was almost musical, a mother's encouragement. Colt lifted his head proudly, chest heaving, and took a single brave step. The ranch felt warmer in that moment than it had all spring. That evening, when the sun dipped low behind the ridge and the barn glowed in orange light, Caleb brought feed to the mare. She had grown steadier, calmer, filling in with muscle where bones once pressed through her skin. He approached slowly, giving her every chance to retreat. But she didn't. For the first time since she arrived, the mare didn't step back. Her ears flicked forward in quiet interest as he reached out a hesitant hand. "You've earned your rest, girl," he whispered. He lifted his hand closer. The mare lowered her head gently, deliberately, until her muzzle hovered near his shoulder. Caleb touched her neck with an open palm, expecting her to tense. Instead, she leaned into him. Her weight was soft, trusting, and full of a meaning he couldn't put into words. He closed his eyes and breathed in the warm, earthy scent of her coat. "You did good, girl," he murmured. Real good. He never imagined a horse could break a man's heart open so quietly. A few days later, as he was cleaning the stall, Caleb found the old wooden board that had been tied to the mare during the auction. The white paint was chipped, the number faded, but he recognized it immediately. Auction lot 47. He turned it over in his hands for a long moment, remembering the dust, the jeering laughter the moment he had spoken up, without understanding why. He ran his thumb over the worn edges. This wasn't a reminder of where she came from. It was a reminder of the moment everything changed. Caleb carried the board into the barn and nailed it to the wall of her stall, not as a brand of shame, but as a marker of the day their lives collided. After stepping back to survey it, he touched the sign gently and whispered, "You're home." The mare lifted her head as if she understood. Spring rolled in with warm breezes and the scent of wet soil drifting across the valley. Snowmelt trickled down the nearby hills, feeding fresh grass that sprouted in vibrant green patches across the pasture. At dawn, deer wandered near the fence line, unbothered by the presence of horses or humans. Wildflowers dotted the edges of the property, painting soft colors across the land like forgotten brush strokes. The mare took full advantage of the change. She galloped across the field, truly galloped for the first time since arriving. Dust flew behind her in a golden arc. Her mane streamed back like a banner reclaimed. She ran with a kind of freedom that looked like memory and hope woven together. Dusty and Colt sprinted after her, clumsy and joyful, their hooves drumming a rhythm across the earth. They tripped, rolled, chased each other, nipped playfully at their mother's tail. Caleb didn't bother shutting the barn doors anymore. He wanted them to feel the openness, the safety, the life, returning to the ranch. Turner Ranch had grown quiet from sorrow, but now the quiet was gone, and Caleb didn't miss it. One evening, as the sun slowly bled orange across the sky, Caleb walked out into the pasture alone. The ranch stretched in soft silhouettes around him. The barn repaired the fences, straightened the house, looking a little less tired. The mare thundered past him, kicking up a wave of dust. Dusty raced behind her, followed by Colt, whose small legs now carried him with surprising strength. Their hooves struck the ground like war drums, beating out a promise life goes on. Caleb closed his eyes, letting the warm wind press against his cheeks. For so long he had lived inside silence, heavy, suffocating silence. The silence of grief, of failure, of a ranch falling apart faster than he could patch it. But now there was noise everywhere. Hoofbeats, snorts, the bright, sharp whinny of a foal discovering speed, the laughter of neighbors helping rebuild a life. Even the wind sounded kinder. He opened his eyes and watched the three horses race across the field, the mare glancing back at him with something like gratitude or maybe companionship. She wasn't the only one who had healed. Everything that came after the fences, the laughter, the running foals had begun with a moment people called foolish. A single bid, a broken mare, two fragile foals, a cowboy with nothing left to lose, and yet somehow everything to gain. He thought of the auction that day. The dust, the noise, the cracking gavel, the jeers, the way she had looked at him, as if asking whether the world had anything left worth believing in. He hadn't known it then, but that moment became the turning point, not just for her, but for him. Caleb walked to the top of the small hill behind the ranch. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the valley, warm and golden. He whispered into the gentle wind the words spoken only for himself and maybe for the mare who paused mid-gallop to look his way. Guess we saved each other. And the ranch, once silent and dying, breathed again. Because hope had come home. The first time the past came back to Turner Ranch, it arrived in a silver SUV. Caleb was stacking feed sacks by the barn when he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. He dusted his hands on his jeans and turned toward the drive. A late-model SUV eased to a stop just outside the sagging front gate. The door opened, and a woman stepped out, blinking into the Wyoming sun. She looked to be in her early 30s, maybe a little older. Dark circles rimmed her eyes, as if sleep had been a stranger for a long time. But her posture was straight, her chin set with quiet resolve. In one hand, she carried a worn canvas bag stuffed with folders and envelopes. Caleb walked toward the gate, wary by habit. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked. The woman swallowed, glanced past him toward the pasture where the mare grazed with Dusty and Colt, then met his eyes. "My name is Claire Lawson," she said softly. "I think the mare you have belonged to my father." The words landed between them like a stone. Claire gripped the strap of her bag, fingers trembling. I was hoping we could talk, just for a little while." Caleb hesitated, then unlatched the gate. "All right," he said. "Come on in." They sat at the small kitchen table inside the house, a pot of coffee between them. The place was simple but clean, Caleb's attempt to drag the old home back from the edge of neglect. Through the window they could see the mare in the yard, Dusty circling her and Colt trotting at her side. Claire set the canvas bag on the table and loosened the flap. "I brought some things," she said, almost apologetically. "I wasn't sure what you'd want to know." From the bag she pulled photographs, glossy sun-faded at the edges. Caleb leaned closer despite himself. In the pictures, the mare was younger, fuller her coat, a rich, gleaming bay. Her eyes were bright and alert, her muscles round and powerful beneath shining skin. In one photo, she soared over a jump legs, tucked tight mane flying. In another, she stood beside a tall man in a show jacket, a blue ribbon pinned to her bridle. She had a name, Claire said, her voice catching. Sparrow. My dad named her that because when she was a filly, she'd jump any fence you put in front of her. Said she moved like a bird. Caleb traced a thumb along the edge of a photo. The horse in the picture looked like a creature from another life. It was hard to reconcile that proud animal with the scarred, thin mare he'd led out of the auction pen. She was his favorite, Claire continued. He trained her himself. We did trail shows, liberty work, a little bit of barrel racing for fun. He used to say she'd never be just a brood mare. She was too smart for that. Her gaze shifted, unfocused, drifting backward in time. After my father died, the ranch fell apart, she said. We couldn't keep up. Hank Mercer came around offering to buy the place. Said he'd maintain the bloodlines, keep Sparrow in training, keep her legacy alive. Her mouth twisted. We believed him. She pulled out a folded sales contract, a copy of a check, more documents. Then she reached for a single photograph, one of Sparrow and her father, together, the man's hand resting proudly on the mare's neck. We thought he'd take care of her, Claire whispered, eyes shining. We had no idea what he did to her. Her shoulders shook once. She pressed her fingers to her lips, trying to hold in the sound, but a quiet sob escaped anyway. Caleb didn't say anything. There wasn't much to say. Outside, the mare lifted her head ears, pricking toward the house as if she could feel the shift in the air. They walked to the barn together. Caleb opened the gate and motioned for Claire to go ahead. The mare was inside, resting in the shade, while Dusty and Colt played with a dangling length of rope. When the door creaked, she tensed, swinging her head toward them. At first, she was all instinct, ears pinned, feet ready to move, body angling to keep the foals behind her. Then she heard Claire's voice. Sparrow. Claire said softly, her breath trembling. Sweetheart, it's me. Something in the mare seemed to loosen. Her ears flicked forward, her nostrils flared, testing the air. She took a hesitant step forward, then another, neck stretching out as if reaching across years. Claire stepped slowly into the stall hands, open, tears already slipping free. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I should have protected you. Sparrow closed the last inches between them and pressed her muzzle into Claire's open palm. Claire broke. She wrapped her arms around the mare's neck, burying her face in the rough maned shoulders, shaking with the force of everything she'd kept inside. I didn't know, she choked out. I didn't know what he did to you. The mare stood still, eyes half closed, as if surrendering once again to a love she'd thought was gone forever. Caleb watched from the doorway, the weight of the moment settling heavy in his chest. All the abuse, all the lost years, all the choices made by the people who cared more about profit than lives, was all here in the simple way Sparrow leaned into the woman who had once been her family. Later, they stood by the pasture fence, watching Sparrow graze with her foals. The wind tugged at Claire's hair as she spoke. I restored my father's place, she said quietly. Took me years. It's not what it used to be, but it's home again. We have good pasture, a solid barn, a vet on call. She swallowed. If you'd let her come back with me, I'd make sure she wanted for nothing. She deserves. Her words faltered as Sparrow lifted her head. The mare looked toward them, then took 2 deliberate steps back, not away from the woman, but closer to Dusty and Colt. She positioned herself square between the foals, and the fence line muscles relaxed, but certain. She had chosen her place. Caleb caught Claire's eye. "She's already made her choice," he said gently. Claire stared at Sparrow for a long moment. The regret in her gaze didn't vanish, but something else joined it, a quiet acceptance. "I guess she has," she whispered. When she looked back at Caleb, there were tears in her eyes, but also a soft, grateful smile. She reached up, fingers brushing his cheek in a brief, trembling touch. "Thank you," she said, "for giving her what we couldn't." Before she left, Claire rummaged one last time through her bag in the back of the SUV. She emerged with a folded blanket and a couple of boxes. This was her show blanket, she said, handing it to Caleb. It was worn but sturdy, embroidered with a faded name, Sparrow's Flight. She wore it when she won her first big class with my dad. From the boxes, she pulled out a bag of high-quality feed and a small training saddle suitable for a young horse. "For the boys when they're ready," she smiled. "If you ever need anything. Sparrow is family, and so are you." Caleb didn't trust himself to answer, with more than a nod. When the silver SUV disappeared down the road, the ranch felt different. Not emptier, not fuller, just more complete. Like a story that had finally been told all the way through. That evening, Caleb hung one of the old photos Claire had given him on the barn wall. In it, Sparrow was younger, her coat gleaming, her eyes alive with fire as she flew over a jump. He looked at the picture, then turned to the mare who stood content with Dusty and Colt nudging at her sides. "You weren't broken," he murmured, "just waiting." Hardy whines of Wyoming shook the old barn. But this time Sparrow stood steady, her foals on either side of her, like the centerpiece of a picture that at last made sense. The first snowstorm of the season wasn't supposed to be that bad. At least that's what the forecast said. Early front light accumulation, the radio reported that afternoon. But by evening, the wind had changed its tune. It howled down off the mountains with a ferocity that rattled the windows and drove a knife-edge chill through every crack in the house. Caleb moved fast, pulling extra straw into the barn, double-checking the latches on the doors, securing loose boards. The sky had gone from steel gray to nearly black clouds pressed low and heavy, swallowing the last of the light. By the time the first snowflakes started to fall fat and fast, the ranch was sealed as best he could make it. He was sliding the barn door closed when the wind slammed something hard against the side of the building. A board snapped. The bang echoed like a gunshot. Inside the stall, Colt jerked his head up, eyes wild. Before Caleb could reach the latch, the colt bolted, squeezing through the gap as the door thudded open again under the force of the wind. "Colt!" Caleb shouted. The little horse shot out into the white, swallowed instantly by swirling snow. Dusty whinnied sharply and kicked the stall wall. Sparrow threw her weight against the door, slamming the wood with her chest, eyes rolling in panic. "Damn it!" Caleb hissed, wrenching the door fully open. "Stay!" He ordered the mare, but she was half mad with fear, every line of her body screaming, "My baby is out there." Caleb grabbed his coat and ran. Snow already coated the ground, turning the world into a blank, shifting sheet of white. The wind howled loud enough to steal his breath. He could barely see 10 feet in front of him. "Colt!" he bellowed, trudging forward, boots punching through drifts that deepened with every step. The snow stung his eyes, clung to his lashes, burned his cheeks. Behind him, he heard a crash. He turned just in time to see Sparrow burst through the broken stall rail wood, splintering around her chest. She didn't hesitate. She plunged into the storm muscles, bunching head low against the wind. Mare Caleb shouted, but she was already disappearing into the white haze. He swore under his breath and followed. For what felt like hours, he searched. He tracked the faint impressions of small hooves where they hadn't yet been buried by the blizzard. He stumbled, slipped, and caught himself on rocks slick with ice. Each time he stopped to listen, the wind roared back louder, angrier, swallowing his calls whole. Colt, he yelled again, voice breaking. Colt, nothing. Then faint almost imagined a soft, desperate whinny. Caleb turned toward the sound and pushed forward, legs heavy as if chained. At last, through the curtain of snow, he saw a small shape huddled beneath a low rock shelf. Colt stood there, legs shaking, head hanging sides, heaving with frightened breaths. "It's okay," Caleb gasped, dropping to his knees beside him. "I got you." He wrapped both arms around the colt's neck, trying to pull him out just as his boots slipped on the ice. Caleb's feet went out from under him. His head struck the ground hard enough to send a flash of white across his vision. The world spun. For a heartbeat, he lay there, stunned, cold water seeping down the back of his collar. Hoofbeats thundered in from the white. Sparrow emerged from the storm like something pulled from a legend chest, heaving coat plastered with snow eyes blazing. She slid to a stop near them, swung her body sideways, and planted her hooves. Without hesitation, she stepped between them and the wind. The full force of the blizzard hammered her flank. She lowered her head, pressing her shoulder into Caleb's back and curling her body around Colt. Her breath blasted hot against Caleb's cheek, steam mingling with the freezing air. For a long moment, the three of them huddled there, man, mare, and Colt, bound together by the single stubborn refusal to give up. Caleb dragged himself upright, fingers numb. He looped an arm around Colt's neck and grabbed a fistful of Sparrow's mane with his other hand. "Good girl," he panted. "I'm right here. We're going home." Step by careful step, Sparrow turned and began to walk, pushing into the storm with a steady, unwavering strength. Caleb stumbled alongside, half-guided, half-dragged by the mare's determination. She moved with the certainty of an animal that knew every contour of this land, every dip and rise, every safe path back. By the time they reached the barn, Caleb's legs felt like wood and his hands like stone. But they made it. Inside, the air was marginally warmer. Dusty rushed to the stall door, neighing in frantic relief. Caleb shoved it open, herded Colt inside, then sagged against the wall chest, burning. He lit the stove with shaking fingers, fed it kindling until a glow sprang to life. He draped blankets over Colt, rubbing his legs, watching his breathing. Outside, the storm still screamed, rattling the roof. Sparrow didn't lie down. She stood near Caleb's sides, heaving snow melting down her legs. Every now and then, she lowered her head to touch her muzzle to his shoulder or to Colt's neck, as if taking attendance, making sure they were both still there. Hours slipped by like that. The barn became a small, fragile island of warmth in an ocean of ice and wind. By dawn, the storm had spent itself. The world outside was buried under a clean, blinding white. The sun rose sharp and bright, turning every snowdrift into a sheet of light. Caleb stepped out into the stillness lungs, filling with the crisp post-storm air. Then he turned back to Sparrow, running his hand gently along her neck. "You didn't just trust me," he said softly. "You saved me." The mare leaned in and touched her forehead to his, closing her eyes. In that moment, he knew he wasn't just a man who had rescued a horse. He was part of her herd. Word of the storm and what had happened in it spread through Riverton like a tale told around a campfire. Did you hear that mare led him back through the blizzard? Saved the colt, too. Folks are calling her the miracle mare. The Foals picked up their own stories. Dusty and Colt became the Storm Brothers, their near miss, turning them into small legends in their own right. More people started stopping by Turner Ranch, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of respect. They brought feed blankets, old tack cash, and envelopes with no return address. One afternoon, Emily Carter leaned against the fence beside Caleb, watching Sparrow graze with the boys. "You know," she said, "what you've got here. It's more than just a ranch now." Caleb squinted at her. "What do you mean?" She turned to face him fully. "Caleb, why don't we turn this place into a sanctuary?" He stared at her, unsure he'd heard right. "A sanctuary," he repeated. Emily nodded. "There are a lot of horses out there like Sparrow. Used up, thrown away, left in cages with "for sale" signs and no future. We could bring them here, heal them, give them a life again." She gestured toward the mare. "Let her be the heart of it. She's already showing them how to trust again." Caleb looked back at the field. The idea scared him. It sounded big, risky, more responsibility than he'd ever imagined taking on. For so long, he'd struggled just to keep himself afloat. Now Emily was talking about lifting others too. But in his chest, something steady answered. It felt right. "We don't have much," he said slowly. Emily smiled. "You've got land, you've got heart, and you've got a miracle mare. The rest, people will help." She hadn't been wrong before. He nodded once. "All right," he said. "Let's do it." The first new arrivals came within weeks. A children's pony whose owners had outgrown him and decided he wasn't worth the feed. An old ranch horse, ribs showing one bad leg, away from the slaughter truck. A mule cross with a twisted ear and a reputation for being too much trouble. They arrived nervous, hollow-eyed, uncertain of what awaited them. Sparrow met each one with the quiet authority of someone who had survived the worst and come out the other side. She approached, slowly gave space, then offered calm companionship. Within days, the newcomers grazed closer to her tails, flicking in peace. People donated lumber nails and labor. The old barn expanded. New stalls were built. A small paddock for rehabilitation took shape near the front gate. Someone painted a new sign and helped Caleb hang it on the rebuilt ranch archway, "Turner Sanctuary, where broken lives begin again." It wasn't fancy. The letters weren't perfectly straight. But to Caleb, it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Dusty grew into a strong, confident gelding, often trotting along the fence line to welcome nervous newcomers. Colt, still smaller than his brother, had a gentler way. Nervous horses relaxed when he stood beside them, his quiet courage contagious. They hadn't just survived their past. They were helping others survive theirs. One evening, as the sky blushed pink and gold, Caleb leaned against the fence and watched Sparrow lead her 2 sons and a growing herd of rescues across the pasture. Hoofbeats drummed a steady rhythm into the earth. Tails flagged manes lifted breath, steaming lightly in the cooling air. The ranch was full of sound, full of motion, full of second chances. A breeze swept up from the valley, carrying the scent of grass horses and distant rain. Caleb closed his eyes for a heartbeat, letting it wash over him. This isn't just a ranch anymore. He thought the words forming with quiet certainty. It's a beginning. 10 years can change a land. It can carve new lines in a man's face, soften a once wild herd, or turn a broken ranch into something that feels like a promise. As the sun dipped behind the rolling Wyoming hills, the world glowed in honeyed gold. Long shadows stretched over the plains, brushing past the new wooden sign, standing proudly at the entrance, Turner Sanctuary, where broken lives begin again. The old gate Caleb once feared would collapse now stood strong and straight. Fences ran in clean lines across the fields of wild grass that shimmered in the evening breeze. Laughter drifted through the air from a group of young volunteers leading rescue horses to the paddocks, their bright voices mixed with the soft thuds of hooves and the rustling whisper of cottonwoods. 10 years ago, a voice inside Caleb's mind murmured, this place was barely standing. A weathered plaque near the barn caught the last of the sunlight over 127 horses rescued. Turner Ranch wasn't a ranch anymore. It had become a sanctuary, real living and full of stories worth telling. Caleb walked across the yard with a steady, unhurried step. His hair was grayer now, silver dusted through the brown, and faint lines creased the corners of his eyes. But there was strength in his stride, a gentleness in the way he carried himself. He stopped beside a group of high school students gathered near the training ring. They were listening with wide eyes as he explained how to approach a frightened horse. You move slow, he told them. Let him see your hands. Let him hear your voice. And most important, don't give him a reason to be scared. One girl raised her hand, her voice small but curious. Mr. Turner, were they really broken when you found them? Caleb smiled soft and deep. No, he said. Just scared. The girl nodded thoughtfully. The horses seemed to understand too, lowering their heads as the students approached. Caleb watched them with pride. He wasn't just rescuing horses anymore. He was teaching the next generation how to heal them, how to listen, how to love without condition. A decade ago, he'd been a man crawling out of ruin. Now he was someone others looked to for steady ground. Down by the cottonwood tree, the same tree that had shaded the ranch since before Caleb was born, stood Sparrow. Age had silvered her muzzle and softened the muscles once tight beneath her coat. She moved slower, her joints stiff with time, but there remained a quiet dignity in her posture. She still carried herself like the mare she once had been, the leader, the survivor, the heart of the sanctuary. New horses often drifted toward her first. Something in her presence calmed them, told them without words, "You're safe here." Caleb lowered himself onto the bench beneath the cottonwood. Sparrow noticed and ambled over her steps, careful but sure. When she reached him, he gently brushed a hand along her neck, feeling the warmth beneath the aging coat. "You started all of this, girl," he whispered. Sparrow blinked slowly, breathing out a soft sigh. A young volunteer passing by paused. "Mr. Turner," the boy asked, "why does she seem different from the others?" Caleb looked at Sparrow as she lifted her head to the wind. "Because," he said, "she remembers what it's like to be unwanted." The boy nodded, understanding more from Sparrow's steady gaze than from Caleb's words. Dusty trotted along the fence line, powerful and confident. He had grown into a broad-chested gelding with a commanding presence, often stepping forward when new rescues were brought in. It was Dusty who would guide them into the herd, a role he seemed born for. Colt, smaller but bright-eyed, grazed nearby with a gentle sway to his tail. He'd become a favorite in the sanctuary's therapy program. Children on the autism spectrum gravitated to him, drawn to his patience and warm, steady breaths. Veterans struggling with memories too heavy to carry often found comfort leaning against his shoulder. One afternoon, a former Marine stood beside Colt, brushing his mane with slow, deliberate strokes. When Colt lifted his head and nudged the man lightly, the Marine laughed, a sound rough from years of disuse, but real. Caleb watched from a distance, his heart swelling. He almost didn't make it through that first winter, he thought. Now look at him. Both brothers had grown into symbols of hope, one a leader, the other a healer. Their stories had shaped the sanctuary as much as Caleb's or Sparrow's. Later, when the volunteers had gone home and the sanctuary settled into dusk, Caleb stepped outside again. The wind had softened, carrying the faint scent of sage and the far-off call of a hawk returning to its nest. Sparrow stood by the fence, her silhouette lit by the fading sun. When she saw Caleb, she walked toward him with a slow, deliberate grace. He rested his arms on the top rail. "Hey, girl." Sparrow pressed her muzzle against his sleeve. Caleb chuckled softly. "You remember that auction?" he asked, his voice low and warm. "I sure do." He paused, staring at the horizon where the sun melted into amber light. "I didn't think I was saving anything that day." He shook his head, a small smile pulling at his lips. "Turns out, you were saving me." Sparrow leaned her head against his shoulder, just like she'd done that very first time. The gesture hit him with all the weight of memory, all the years they'd built together. He closed his eyes, letting the moment settle deep inside his chest. The sanctuary's reputation had grown far beyond Riverton. Articles appeared in regional newspapers celebrating the program's success. Other ranchers inspired by Turner's sanctuary began treating their aging or injured horses with more care. Word spread about the Mare who changed everything. Near the barn hung a new wooden plaque in honor of Sparrow, the Mare who chose hope. One afternoon, a little girl stood before the plaque, running her fingers over the carved letters. "Why does it say she chose hope?" she asked. Caleb knelt beside her, his voice gentle. "Because she could have stayed afraid," he explained, "but she chose to trust instead." The girl looked toward Sparrow, in the field awe softening her features. Caleb felt something warm bloom inside him, knowing the Mare's story would outlive both of them. Her legacy wasn't just in the horses saved, but in the hearts changed. As evening settled fully onto the sanctuary, the sky blazed in hues of orange, violet, and gold. It was the kind of sunset that made the world feel wide and forgiving. Sparrow stood in the middle of the pasture, Dusty on her left, Colt on her right. Behind them grazed the herd rescued horses of all colors, ages, and histories, each of them carrying a story of survival. Caleb leaned against the fence, arms crossed loosely as he took in the scene. The wind lifted his hair, carrying with it the rustle of grass and distant voices of volunteers finishing their chores. He watched the Mare who started it all, the foals who had grown into leaders, the sanctuary that had risen from ruin. He watched a future he had never dared imagine unfold before him. Some choices don't just change a life, he thought. They change generations. The last light of the day wrapped the sanctuary in a glowing embrace, as if agreeing with him, as if blessing the land that had become a refuge, not only for horses, but for the man who chose them. Far in the field, Sparrow raised her head toward the sinking sun, her silhouette strong and timeless. Dusty and Colt flanked her like guardians, and the herd gathered behind them in quiet unity. And as the sky dimmed into twilight, the sanctuary stood steady, its fences straight, its pastures full, its legacy secure. A home born from a single, impossible choice. A beginning that would outlive them all. Thank you so much for being part of this journey with us. Your time, your comments, and your support truly mean everything. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to our channel and turning on notifications so you never miss the next story of hope, courage, and second chances.